On November 20th, 1943, at 0541 hours, Bedio Island in the Tarawa Atoll witnessed a tense moment. Rear Admiral Kei Shibazaki's binoculars shook faintly as he pulled them away from his gaze, observing how the murky pre-dawn gloom burst into chaos from naval barrages that would ultimately fall far short against his stronghold. Conquering Tarawa would demand 1 million troops and a full century of effort. From the narrow viewing slot in his fortified concrete headquarters, nestled beneath 10 feet of coral sand and coconut logs, Shibazaki assessed the fortifications that embodied the finest achievements in Japanese military design. The 4,500 Imperial Marines of the Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's top-tier unit, held positions built over 15 months. Every viewpoint had been meticulously planned, every shooting zone overlapped seamlessly, and every stretch of shoreline was pre-sighted for cannon fire. The oncoming Americans remained oblivious to the fact that they were heading toward the deadliest concentrated battlefield ever devised on a mere 291 acres, an area tinier than Central Park. In exactly 76 hours, 18,000 U.S. Marines would shatter his convictions in devastating fashion, albeit at a price that stunned the nation and reshaped the nature of sea-to-land combat forever. The clash generated losses beyond belief. More than 3,000 American injuries and deaths, encompassing 193 Marines slain and 2,001 hurt. From the 4,500 Japanese troops holding the line, just 17 emerged alive in captivity, joined by 129 Korean workers. Unbeknownst to Shibazaki or the advancing Marines, they were on the verge of the fiercest outburst of destruction in modern military annals. A fight that would rack up more victims per square yard than any conflict preceding or following it. Bedio Island spanned under half a square mile, stretching 3,800 yards in length and reaching 600 yards across at its broadest, with the highest point only 10 feet above the waves. Within this confined zone, the Japanese amassed defensive strength that would have awed the architects of the Maginot Line. Starting in September 1942, Korean workers and Japanese builders had reshaped this coral atoll into a military marvel without precedent. They turned a whole island into one vast bastion. The figures were staggering. More than 100 primary pillboxes and shelters, 14 shore batteries, among them 4 enormous 8-inch Vickers naval guns acquired from Britain back in 1905, 40 artillery cannons, plus over 200 machine gun nests, all mutually shielding one another in a web that eliminated any blind spots along the beaches. The building process itself showcased engineering brilliance. Major shelters featured concrete barriers up to 5 feet thick, crafted from a unique blend incorporating pulverized coral for superior durability over ordinary mixes. Above these sat layers of coconut trunks and dense palm wood that refused to sink, acting as extra shields. Some logs measured 18 inches across and could endure massive blasts. Rails transported from Japan at vast cost formed supports capable of resisting straight hits from warships' big guns. The whole setup got buried under sand and coral, up to 10 to 12 feet in spots, which dissipated explosions more effectively than today's advanced substances. The Japanese further installed distinctive hexagonal steel pillboxes, some relics from the Russo-Japanese war days, adding to the array of hardy outposts. These metal units, paired with the concrete emplacements, wove a defense system of remarkable toughness. November 19, 1943. Aboard the USS Maryland, 125 miles southwest of Tarawa, Major Michael P. Ryan positioned himself on the deck, taking in the vast fleet encircling him. This marked the biggest sea invasion group the U.S. had mustered in the Pacific campaign up to that point. 17 carriers, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 66 destroyers, and 36 troop transports bearing the 2nd Marine Division, battle-hardened from Guadalcanal, who figured they'd already faced the Japanese at their fiercest. They couldn't have been more mistaken. The intel summary had sounded assured. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner assured the Marines that the initial shelling would be so comprehensive they'd essentially stroll onto the beach without resistance. The bombardment strategy aimed to unleash thousands of rounds over 3 hours, packing more destructive force onto one objective than any prior Pacific strike. Yet some Marines nursed reservations. Colonel David Shoup, set to command the landing, had pored over every reconnaissance photo until his vision blurred. The island's barriers weren't merely robust, they formed a flawless geometric layout, crafted by an expert in defensive tactics who wielded exact math. Even more concerning were the tidal conditions. The operation hinged on a 5-foot surge to lift the assault boats past the encircling coral reef at Betio. The Navy vowed the rise would suffice. Major Frank Holland, a New Zealand veteran with 15 years in the Gilbert Islands, had cautioned them regarding the tricky tides, a neap tide. This unexpected surge could render the reef vulnerable at the most critical moments. Although Major Holland had cautioned about erratic tidal shifts, Navy tidal specialists had mostly overlooked his concerns, confident in their precise forecasts. On November 20th, 1943, at 05:05 hours, the naval barrage commenced as the battleship Maryland unleashed the initial broadside from its 16-inch cannons. In mere moments, the pre-dawn gloom gave way to a man-made dawn, with scores of shipboard artillery pieces erupting in unison. From the troop transports anchored 10 miles out to sea, Marines gazed in astonishment as Betio vanished beneath a towering shroud of dust and flames that soared thousands of feet skyward. The onslaught raged for 3 full hours. Battleships Colorado and Maryland hurled countless 16-inch projectiles, while Tennessee followed with a barrage of 14-inch rounds in quick volleys. Light cruisers unleashed thousands of 6-inch shells, and destroyers kept pounding until their gun tubes burned cherry red from the strain. Altogether, more than 3,000 rounds pummeled the narrow atoll. At 05:42, planes from the carriers joined the fray, with dive bombers and torpedo planes releasing their payloads in coordinated strikes aimed at obliterating every targeted fortification. The billowing haze climbed so tall that vessels 30 miles distant could spot it, yet issues soon emerged. Amid the haze, observers from the fleet relayed alarming updates. The 8-inch shore batteries continued to respond. Anti-aircraft batteries stayed active. As the fog thinned a bit, the concrete bunkers and fortified posts stood unscathed, defying the era's mightiest ordnance like relics from a bygone age. Post-mission analyses would eventually uncover the grim reality regarding the over 100 primary strongpoints on Betio. That 3-hour shelling had neutralized precisely 4. The vast array of thousands of projectiles scattered across 291 acres had failed to focus enough destructive power on any single reinforced site, each comparable in size to a modest dwelling. The island's coral substrate soaked up much of the blast energy, and the palm trunk reinforcements held up impressively against all but pinpoint strikes. November 20th, 1943, 06:30 hours. Major Holland's predictions concerning the elusive tide came to pass in devastating fashion. Naval tide forecasters had projected 5 feet of depth atop the reef at H hour. Holland had argued it wouldn't suffice for the Higgins landing craft, needing at least 4 feet under load. Conditions turned out far grimmer than even he foresaw. The actual depth reached just 3 feet, far from the erroneous 18 inches cited in some later narratives, but utterly insufficient for the vessels regardless. When the lead wave of Higgins boats neared the reef around 0700, they met the sea's cruel deception. The craft stalled against the coral outcrop, 500 to 800 yards from the beach. Marines faced a grueling trek through chest-high surf across the open lagoon, straight into the guns of defenses scarcely affected by the earlier pounding. Just the opening 3 waves boasted amphibious tracked vehicles, LVTs dubbed alligators, capable of surmounting the barrier. Only 125 such machines were on hand, enough to ferry about 1,800 troops at most. The rest of the attackers in those early assaults had to forsake their beached Higgins craft and slog through the deadly shallows on foot. November 20th, 1943, 07:55 hours. As the initial LVTs surmounted the reef and pushed into the lagoon, Rear Admiral Shibazaki's fortification network displayed its ruthless precision. Each machine traversed predetermined slaughter zones, where cannons, howitzers, and automatic weapons could converge their barrages with lethal exactitude. The defenders had devoted months to plotting optimal distances and trajectories for peak destruction. Those LVTs that made it to the sand ran into yet another peril. The beachfront barrier, A 3 to 5 foot high barricade of coconut logs offered the sole shelter available. However, Japanese emplacements were sighted to rake fire alongside the obstacle rather than straight at it. Troops crouching behind the timbers for safety wound up vulnerable to flanking volleys from several angles. This unconventional layout highlighted the ingenuity of the enemy's strategy. Casualty figures from that opening hour shocked the high command. From the 125 LVTs dispatched in the first assaults, 90 fell to damage or destruction. The meticulously plotted firing lanes performed flawlessly, with fortifications interlocking in a fatal lattice of overlapping shots. November 20th, 1943, 08:30 hours. The subsequent waves, 4th, 5th, and 6th, confronted the raw terror of storming fortified shores. Stranded on the reef in their Higgins boats, some 3,500 Marines commenced the 700-yard trudge across the lagoon. Depths fluctuated from waist level to over their heads, dictated by submerged coral ridges. Soldiers burdened with 60-pound kits could barely manage a deliberate pace. The Japanese had foreseen such desperation. They zeroed their mortars on the reef line where vessels would beach. Their heavy machine guns covered the expanse with woven patterns of grazing fire. The transparent waters of the tropics hid nothing. At a typical crossing rate indeed, every Marine endured targeted gunfire for a full 35 minutes during the approach, an endless stretch in the heat of battle. Losses piled up with ruthless speed. Whole platoons vanished before they could hit the shore. Soldiers struck once would submerge, fight to resurface just to take another hit. The burden of their gear ensured that injured troops who blacked out would sink in mere 3 feet of surf. Blood churning in the waves drew sharks, injecting fresh terror into the already hellish ordeal. November 20th, 1943. 09:15 hours. Survivors of the crossing faced yet another dire predicament. The seawall, their sole shelter, could barely accommodate around 500 troops along the reachable sections. By 9:30, more than 2,500 Marines crammed into that area, with reinforcements pouring in non-stop. Anyone left out had no choice but to sprawl vulnerable on the bare sand or in the surf. The enemy's emplacements now showed their cunning layout. One bunker alone could rake fire across hundreds of yards of seawall. Guns positioned at varying elevations could shoot over frontline Marines to strike those in the rear. Mortars stood pre-sighted on the wall's spots, letting Japanese crews rain shells with pinpoint lethality even blind to their marks. This calculated setup turned the zone into a death trap where staying alive hinged on luck alone, not strategy. Troops hugging the seawall gained only about 18 inches of cover. Stirring it all invited blasts from scores of Japanese arms. November 20th, 1943, 10:30 hours. Colonel David Shoup slogged to the beach after his craft blew up 500 yards offshore. Shrapnel tore into his leg amid the crossing, yet he stayed on his feet, setting up his HQ flush against the seawall and gauging the disaster. From the 3,500 Marines who'd tried landing in the opening 2 hours, roughly 1,500 lay wounded or dead. The foothold they gripped stretched about 700 yards wide and pushed inland no more than 20 yards at best, but Shoup spotted a key flaw in the foe's lines. Though the strong points backed one another, knocking out a single bunker would tear open a hole in the overlapping kill zones. Such breaches might let attackers flank other spots from undefended sides. The flawless barrier design hid its own weakness. It demanded all posts stay operational. Through a sputtering radio, Shoup broadcast the commands that shaped the fight. Press on with the offensive, no matter the toll. Retreat was off the table, as was any halt to regroup. Success demanded unyielding drive until the enemy grid broke. November 20th, 1943, 1100 hours. The clash's pivot didn't stem from planned strikes, but from lone Marines choosing to charge isolated targets against all reason. These bold moves, appearing reckless, started fraying the Japanese web. Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins first guided his scout sniper team through assaults on enemy holds. Standard tactics warned that charging across exposed terrain toward bunkers spelled doom. Hawkins defied the rules. Backed by a few daring comrades, he methodically took out several machine gun nests with grenades, explosives, and shots from his rifle. Fatally hurt on November 21st, Hawkins had already knocked out or disabled 6 hostile sites, opening vital rifts in the defenses. Staff Sergeant William J. Bourdillon, bearing multiple wounds, charged 2 machine gun posts with blasts on November 20th. He wrecked both before dying in a push on a third. His effort erased a vital hub that had ravaged troops along the seawall. Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., an engineer who ditched a thriving career to join up, spearheaded the push against the biggest Japanese stronghold, a huge bomb-resistant bunker doubling as HQ. On November 22nd, Bonnyman rallied Marines up the dune, masking the bunker amid savage fire. At the crest, he exposed himself completely, blasting into the openings while his squad hauled up charges. He clung there until gunned down, but his stand enabled the destruction of that key asset. November 20th, 1943, 1400 hours. Within the surviving Japanese bunkers, a grim awareness took hold. The Americans defied what doctrine expected from heavy hits. Formations battered to 50% strength, the threshold where most outfits crumble, kept surging forward. The Marines soaked up blows that ought to shatter any force. Still, they hammered on. The Japanese had built their stand on the idea that no sensible army would keep charging after SUF suffering 30% losses was a key element factored into their strategy for defense. Yet the Marines showed that sheer willpower could defy strategic calculations. The Japanese troops, despite their thorough preparations, couldn't counter this unpredictable factor. Their meticulously designed perimeter, with overlapping arcs of fire, demanded that soldiers stay rooted in place. However, as the Marines systematically neutralized each outpost, openings started to form in the barrier line. These breaches enabled further Marine advances, generating additional vulnerabilities and hastening the overall breakdown of the fortifications. On November 20th, 1943, at 1600 hours, the incoming tide at last permitted certain landing vessels to hit the shore unhindered, even if plenty continued to stall on the coral barrier. Fresh troops started pouring in more steadily, enduring fierce barrages nonetheless. What had served as an outright slaughter zone just 6 hours prior had transformed into a disorganized yet workable entry point, where Marines secured their footholds and inched forward across the island through relentless combat. Despite his injuries, Colonel Shoup directed operations from beside the seawall, relying on messengers to relay orders. These were volunteers who braved open terrain raked by gunfire to deliver dispatches. The death toll among these couriers was staggering, yet willing participants kept stepping up. Their bravery and sustaining links proved essential for orchestrating the offensive, especially after most radios succumbed to seawater or hostile rounds. Such personal valor was yielding broader impacts, upending the Japanese calculations of firing lanes and loss projections. The Marines illustrated how resolve could neutralize entrenched superiorities. Gains came in mere yards, exacted at enormous price, but forward movement persisted. By 2100 hours on November 20th, 1943, as night enveloped the initial day's action, the U.S. forces clung to a tenuous lodgment on the beach. From roughly 5,000 Marines who tried to come ashore, more than 1,500 had fallen or been wounded. Still, they were established on land and had shown Shibazaki's bastion could be breached. The evening introduced fresh perils. Seasoned in nocturnal warfare, the Japanese geared up for possible counterstrikes. Rather than a classic all-out banzai rush, they launched modest reconnaissance raids aimed at slipping through Marine perimeters. Anticipating a full-scale onslaught, the Marines stayed vigilant all night. Colonel Shoup instructed his fatigued units to fortify their spots and gear up for the coming day's clashes. Patrols in small teams kept testing Japanese lines, pinpointing soft spots for the following assaults. The Marines found that their foes, though imposing in static defenses, struggled more in dynamic nighttime skirmishes where the benefits of bunkers faded. At 600 hours on November 21st, 1943, daybreak exposed the previous day's devastation and the evolving battlefield dynamics. Overnight Marine arrivals had boosted their numbers on Bedio to about 7,000 fighters. The Japanese, barred from adding troops or supplies, had suffered around 1,000 fatalities among defenders. Major Michael P. Ryan spearheaded a vital push onto Green Beach along Bedio's western edge. This sector faced lighter opposition compared to the northern landing sites of the primary attack. Ryan's contingent came ashore with fewer losses and swiftly drove eastward along the Adel's length, striking Japanese holdings from unforeseen angles, lacking preparation or reinforcement. The methodical dismantling of enemy bastions gained momentum. Through hard-learned tactics for clearing pillboxes, the Marines tailored approaches to each site, whether unleashing close-range shots from the Sherman tanks now on solid ground or deploying combat engineers armed with explosives and flame projectors. The routine was deliberate and savage: pin down with suppressive barrages, close in with charges, obliterate, then proceed onward. At 1400 hours on November 21, 1943, the drive against Admiral Shibazaki's headquarters bunker, the island's most imposing fortification, marked a pivotal shift in the conflict. This enormous edifice, featuring 5-foot-thick concrete barriers buried under heaps of sand and coral, included numerous embrasures and subterranean rooms accommodating up to 300 personnel. The operation demanded joint efforts from armor, sappers, and foot soldiers. Sherman tanks blasted directly into the slits while Marines laid down protective volleys. Sappers dashed ahead, lobbing explosives into every crevice. When that failed to penetrate the core, Marines employed bulldozers to pile sand and coral over the access points, entombing those within. The ultimate measure was ruthlessly decisive. Vast quantities of fuel were funneled through the air shafts and set alight. The ensuing blast and inferno claimed roughly 300 Japanese lives. Admiral Shibazaki himself, like Admiral Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, likely perished in one of these fortified positions, although his corpse could not be conclusively verified amid the charred debris. On November 24, 1943, at 16:30 hours, U.S. forces seized the airfield on Bedio. This key achievement came about on the operation's second day, marking the core purpose behind the assault. Despite heavy shelling, the runway lay inside Marine-held territory and was quickly fixed up for U.S. aircraft. The enemy had focused their fortifications to safeguard this essential asset. Yet their belief that the attackers would fixate solely on seizing the airstrip turned out to be misguided. The Leathernecks proved ready to endure heavy losses just to secure a beachhead, then push ahead methodically without fixating on particular goals. Such a tolerance for steady attrition shattered the foe's defensive strategy. They had geared up against opponents who would zero in on targeted aims rather than those who would press on relentlessly, no matter the price, until the whole atoll fell. By November 22, 1943, at 600 hours, as the sun rose on the third day, Marines held about 2/3 of Betio. Enemy opposition had splintered into scattered holdouts, battling in disarray without unity. From the initial 4,500 troops, under 1,000 still breathed, most injured and all short on rounds. These holdouts, aware their cause was lost, battled with the desperation of those resigned to fate. Every strong point demanded total demolition. Any spot merely subdued would open fire again after Marines moved beyond it. The answer lay in thorough eradication. Incendiary devices flushed out the insides. Explosives brought down the frames, followed by additional flame attacks to guarantee no one lived. On November 22, 1943, at 1,000 hours, the final significant Japanese stand revolved around a network of linked shelters at the island's eastern tip, labeled the Pocket by Marine scouts. Roughly 500 enemy troops had formed a last bastion, channeling their leftover armament along the slim peninsula. Clearing this area took 14 hours of non-stop fighting. Each shelter endured the identical rigorous routine. Armor blasts to pin down, sappers with packs to break through, fire projectors to purge, and foot soldiers to verify clearance. The advance covered about 20 yards per hour, a pace that felt sluggish but outstripped the grueling initial push over the shores. As darkness fell on November 22nd, the Pocket fell. A handful of Japanese survivors launched a desperate banzai assault past midnight, a pointless rush wiped out by Marine automatic weapons. At 13:30 hours on November 23, 1943, following 76 hours of unrelenting engagement, Bedio was pronounced under control. The losses proved devastating. Out of 4,500 Japanese troops, just 17 ended up as captives, Plus, 129 Korean workers compelled to build the defenses also made it through. The enemy suffered a 99.7% loss rate, essentially total destruction. U.S. losses reached 109 Marines and 30 sailors dead, alongside 2,101 hurt. Over those 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division endured more wounds than the Corps saw in 6 months on Guadalcanal. The injury percentage topped 17%, the worst for any U.S. unit in Pacific fights up to then. Yet the tactical triumph stood firm. The runway functioned in mere days, aiding missions across the Central Pacific. Even more crucially, the hard-won insights etched in blood across Tarawa's sandy reefs spared countless lives in later campaigns. The fallout from Tarawa sparked the deepest overhaul of landing tactics in U.S. Armed Forces annals. Planners dissected every phase of the clash, recorded each shortcoming, and examined all triumphs. The fleet admitted its preliminary barrage fell far short. Later assaults would include extended barrages spanning days or weeks instead of mere hours, firing shells with delayed blasts tailored to pierce concrete bunkers. Forming underwater demo squads, early versions of the Navy SEALs guaranteed precise surveys of shorelines and obstacle clearance. The worth of landing vehicles, tracked, got fully validated. Output surged with upgraded variants offering plating and superior barrier navigation. The LVT-2 Water Buffalo and DUKW Carrier became routine gear, averting the lethal lagoon treks that claimed so many at Tarawa. Radio gear got revamped for water resistance, with backups to sustain links if main units broke down. Fresh rounds for cracking bunkers emerged to counter enemy-style defenses. Within 6 months after Tarawa, napalm entered the Pacific arena, delivering a tool suited specially engineered to breach heavily defended strongholds. These advancements all stemmed from particular shortcomings exposed during the Tarawa campaign, bought at the steep cost of Marine lives en route to Tokyo. The defeat at Tarawa reverberated deeply within the Imperial General Headquarters. U.S. forces had achieved what Japanese strategy considered unattainable, enduring massive losses to seize a militarily modest target. Such readiness to endure heavy tolls for a mere islet revealed a level of U.S. commitment that Japanese strategists had gravely misjudged. Tokyo's leaders had figured that unyielding island bastions would wear down American willpower via prolonged attrition. Tarawa shattered that notion. The U.S. proved willing to absorb whatever sacrifices were needed to keep the offensive rolling. This forced a total overhaul of Japan's entire perimeter defense approach. If the Americans would shell out so dearly for Tarawa, nothing across the Pacific theater could halt their progress. Defenders on other atolls pored over Tarawa dispatches, yet the takeaways were profoundly discouraging. The foe had absorbed the errors and vowed not to duplicate them. Subsequent amphibious strikes would unleash superior naval barrages, upgraded gear, and polished maneuvers. Every insight derived from Tarawa's harrowing ordeal and hard-won success. Long after the clash, those who survived Tarawa grappled with describing the ferocity of its 76-hour ordeal. The sheer density of carnage crammed into that confined area and brief span challenged conventional notions of warfare. Pacific Theater Marines, drawing from battles everywhere, consistently deemed Tarawa their grimmest trial, harsher than Iwo Jima, worse than Okinawa, more brutal than Peleliu. Those who endured forged an exclusive brotherhood, united by the shared hell of the deadliest kill zone in Corps annals. During gatherings, they recounted details impossible to fully share with outsiders: the grueling slog across the reef amid shelling, the frantic clash along the beach barrier, the methodical dismantling of bunkers that appeared invincible. Numerous old soldiers revisited Tarawa decades on, struggling to square the serene atoll with the inferno etched in memory. The concrete pillboxes lingered, gradually overtaken by vegetation, while corroded hulls of LVTs poked above the shallows at ebb tide. These enduring relics stood as tributes to victory's heavy levy. The Corps' formal debrief on Tarawa bore the subtitle "Lessons Etched in Blood," recognizing that each proposed fix for tactics had exacted Marine fatalities. It pinpointed 38 key takeaways, tying each to precise lapses that proved deadly. Vital among them: broad naval shelling couldn't neutralize pinpoint defenses. Later assaults demanded sustained targeted barrages from ships. Overhead scouting photos fell short for intel needs. On-the-ground scouting, including diver probes, became indispensable. Tidal forecasts had to build in dire contingencies and backups for surprises. Radios required full submersion proofing plus backup channels. Sinking tanks with foot soldiers wasn't a luxury but a must for cracking pillboxes. Major General Julian Smith, who led the 2nd Marine Division, appended a poignant note summing up Tarawa's core truth. All errors committed had been settled in blood. Yet those offerings yielded wisdom that would spare myriad lives in coming fights. Mere weeks post-conquest, Tarawa validated its worth. B-24 Liberators launching from the restored Strip hammered Japanese holdings across the Marshalls, priming them for the ensuing U.S. push. Recon flights out of Tarawa delivered scouting data crucial for mapping out follow-on campaigns. Yet, Tarawa's truest worth lay in the mind. It convinced the Japanese that no bulwark, no matter its defenses, could derail the American surge if Washington deemed the stakes worthwhile. This realization eroded enemy spirits while bolstering U.S. grit. Embracing such steep costs for triumph showcased a resolve beyond mere battlefield math. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Pacific Fleet Supremo, eventually judged Tarawa the pivot, not for land captured, but for what it revealed about American tenacity and flexibility. The path to Tokyo lay clear, should the nation muster the stomach to press on, price be damned. 3 months post-Tarawa, Leathernecks stormed the Marshalls, applying each hard lesson from the prior fray. The shift was striking. Kwajalein Atoll, sturdier than Tarawa, succumbed at 1/5 the human cost. Eniwetok, similarly entrenched, fell with far slimmer losses than Tarawa's slaughter. The divergences boiled down to method. Extended ship bombardments using penetrating rounds truly razed Japanese works. Plentiful amphibious tractors known as DUKWs removed the hazardous barrier of the reef. Divers from underwater demolition units removed hazards and delivered precise details about the shoreline. Better teamwork between tanks and infantry sped up the clearing of enemy strongholds. Flame-throwing units arrived right with the initial assault. Each of these advancements stemmed straight from the shortcomings exposed at Tarawa. The lives lost on that minuscule atoll bought hard-won tactical insights that revolutionized U.S. amphibious tactics. Subsequent assaults would remain expensive in terms of lives, yet Marines would never again encounter the disastrous convergence of errors that turned Tarawa into a slaughterhouse. Hidden behind the numbers were personal heartbreaks that captured the battle's real toll. Among the 4 who received the Medal of Honor, 3 perished while securing their awards. Hawkins, Banyan, and Borderon sacrificed everything to overrun strongpoints that appeared unbeatable. Just Colonel Shoup lived on to don his medal, eventually serving as the 22nd Commandant of the Marine Corps. Countless Marines suffered injuries that scarred them permanently, both in body and mind. The ferocity of the fighting, packed into such a tight time frame and area, etched psychological wounds that took decades to comprehend fully. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, unrecognized and unnamed back then, haunted innumerable Tarawa survivors as they grappled with their ordeals. The Japanese troops showed matching bravery, falling nearly to the last for their emperor and nation. Their setup for defense was masterful, their defiance zealous, their devotion absolute. Just 17 soldiers and a single officer from the full force made it out alive. This stood as proof of their resolve to battle until the end instead of yielding. The Korean workers who endured added yet another layer to the sorrow. Compelled to construct the defenses and then thrust into the last stand, they suffered in a conflict they hadn't chosen. More of them outlived the Japanese fighters, since a few could give up once it was obvious the enemy couldn't shield them anymore. Tarawa's legacy reached well past the Second World War. The clash turned into essential curriculum at armed forces academies everywhere. Studied not for genius maneuvers, there were few, but for the insights it offered on grit triumphing over readiness. The Japanese had forged an ideal stronghold. Still, the Americans seized it through raw determination and readiness to absorb heavy losses. Today's military principles continue to draw from Tarawa's teachings. The need for spot-on intel, gear tailored for particular battle zones, the vital role of combined efforts across branches, and most crucially, the power of human resolve to surmount strategic weaknesses. Everything links back to those 76 hours on Betio. The rise of elite special units, focus on scouting, creation of accurate arms to breach defenses, and strategy of concentrated might at key spots all spring from the harsh truths of Tarawa. The fight showed that nothing is truly invincible if the assaulters commit to bearing the cost, a truth that echoes far outside battlefield tactics. Admiral Shibazaki's claim that conquering Tarawa would demand 1 million troops over 100 years ranked among history's wildest misjudgments in warfare. Within a mere 76 hours, 18,000 Marines demonstrated that tenacity could breach any bastion, that U.S. democracy could forge fighters as devoted as those from any oppressive regime, and that no setup, no matter how flawless, could resist the charge of liberty's defenders battling for a noble purpose. The math was harsh, yet straightforward. 3,000 U.S. losses to wipe out 4,500 Japanese holdouts and claim one tiny islet. By strict operational standards, the exchange rate in lives was intolerable. Yet conflicts aren't decided solely by such calculations. Victory goes to countries prepared to foot the bill for success. Tarawa revealed that Americans would shoulder that burden. The Japanese strategy rested on the belief that America's regard for individual lives in a democratic system couldn't endure such bloodshed. They learned that when Americans believe in their mission's moral clarity, they'll endure whatever sacrifices victory requires. Tarawa endures as a pivotal clash in U.S. military annals, not for the modest prize of one little airstrip, but for the profound wisdom gained. The engagement reshaped amphibious combat strategies for America, affirmed U.S. commitment to friends and foes alike, and illustrated that no Pacific outpost was unbreakable if the nation resolved to meet victory's demands. The valor shown by Marines at Tarawa grew into myth. Soldiers who trudged through hundreds of yards of water raked by gunfire, stormed entrenched spots with scant protection, pressed forward even when death loomed inevitable. They established that the American warrior ethos could rival the world's fiercest. Their offering secured more than just. The triumph on Tarawa represented more than just a battlefield success. It offered invaluable insights that preserved countless lives in later conflicts. Years afterward, Colonel David Shoup offered what might be the sharpest assessment of the engagement. Shibazaki had declared that 1 million Americans could never seize Tarawa in a century. He misjudged entirely. It required only 18,000 Marines and a span of 76 hours. The gap between his estimate and the actual outcome lay in his reliance on fortifications of cement and iron, while we gauged success through sheer resolve. Tarawa's enduring message extends beyond the annals of warfare. It illustrates how the human spirit can surmount daunting challenges, how those who cherish liberty will endure profound hardships when called upon, and how no oppressive regime, no matter how strongly defended, can withstand the unyielding advance of a free society bent on triumph. Within those 76 hours, the Marines achieved far more than the conquest of a single atoll. They affirmed that the path to Tokyo lay clear, that the American spirit remained unshakable, and that success, no matter the toll, was assured. Admiral Shibazaki erred in every prediction save one. The cost would indeed be staggering. Yet Americans demonstrated their readiness to bear it. Those young fighters who slogged across the lagoon, who sheltered behind the seawall, who stormed those supposedly invincible strongholds, they turned what seemed unattainable into destiny. Through their actions, they etched one of the greatest tales of valor in U.S. military annals, forged in the bloodshed upon the coral shores of a small Pacific outpost named Tarawa.